In my opinion, the single most important advance in television technology has been the advent of high dynamic range, or HDR. Now, if you own a new, or at least a relatively new 4K TV, odds are that TV supports HDR. So you're probably familiar with how these videos look because YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, all these guys, they do a lot of HDR content. And what HDR gives you is a much wider range of brightness values. In this example, I took my camera outside, I just shot my front yard. Now the foreground is properly exposed, but the background is overexposed and it's clipping. The background is simply too bright for all of that detail to be retained. So the house in the back is blown out, the cul-de-sac is blown out, the retaining wall is blown out, and even my own driveway is a little bit blown out. Now if we compare it to this shot, which is the exact same shot on the same camera, but in high dynamic range mode, you can see that everything is still there. We still have all the detail and the color of the background that would have otherwise been blown out. Nothing is blown out here. The home in the back, the retaining wall, the driveway, and the cul-de-sac are all properly exposed. But the problem with HDR is in mastering a HDR film. Odds are you don't own the proper equipment to do it. You can't just shoot in HDR and then edit it on an old system with an SDR display. You can't do it. You have to have an HDR monitor in order to edit in HDR. Well, HDR equipment is really, really expensive. One of the cheapest examples out there would be Apple's new system, their new Pro display with the new Mac Pro. The Mac Pro, you might spend $5,000 on that, but then you're going to have to spend another $5,000 to $6,000 on the display for it. It'll cost you $10,000, $11,000 minimum to do it that way. Or if you really want to use a professional studio monitor, you can pay $30,000, $40,000 for one of those, plus another $1,000 for a converter so that your older Mac system can actually edit on it. The other problem with HDR is the fact that there are multiple competing HDR standards. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details on this, but the long story short is that it's a mess right now. It's kind of a mess like in the old days where you had VHS and Betamax, but it's even worse than that. So if you're trying to output an HDR movie, it gets very complicated dealing with the multiple standards. I don't even want to mess with it right now. Frankly, I'm just going to wait 5 or 7 years and see how things wash out. For now, what I like to do is I deliver all of my movies in SDR. So you're watching right now video that was shot in HDR, but it's being delivered in SDR. And how do you do that? Well, what you do is you do something called tone mapping. What tone mapping does is that it allows you to take this high dynamic range footage and basically compress it down into a standard dynamic range project. It allows you to retain all of the details in what would have been blown out areas. So, in HDR, we're able to retain bright skies. We're able to retain the data in bright windows in the background. That is still retained when we tone map it down, but what we lose is we lose the luminosity range. So if you shoot video of the sun and you tone map it down to SDR, the sun will only appear as a 100 nit brightness disk. But if you keep it as HDR, if you create an HDR project and you play it back as HDR on an HDR TV, it'll appear as a 2000 nit brightness disk. So that's what you lose. You're going to lose that brightness range. But that's okay, because honestly, the most important thing about shooting in HDR is retaining the details and not having the blown out areas. And also having the flexibility to tweak your exposure later in Final Cut Pro and post-production. And HDR gives you a huge amount of flexibility to do that. Pretty much all cameras these days have the ability to shoot in HDR. Different camera manufacturers use different HDR formats. The Sony that I'm shooting on here, it uses HLG. I like to use HLG3. Other cameras like Canon, Panasonic, and all those guys, they have their own thing as well, but they all basically work the same. And just to give you guys an idea of how I set my camera up for this is I go into picture profile, Picture profile 10, that's the default picture profile for HLG. The first thing I do is I set it to HLG 3 because that's not the default. The camera, when you buy it new, defaults to it's one of the other HLG formats. Double check that it's set to the Rec.709 color space, which it should be. And then I go in and I lower the saturation. I set my saturation to -10. And the reason that I set it to -10 is because when you tone map your HDR footage, the colors tend to get oversaturated. This is kind of just part of the nature of tone mapping. But by preemptively lowering the saturation when you record it, it means you have to do less work later in post to fix the saturation. It also prevents the RGB color channels from maxing out and peaking sometimes. So I recommend, at least on the Sony cameras, set the saturation to anywhere between -8 to -10. So when we shoot in HDR, we need to do what's called exposing to the right. And what exposing to the right basically means is it means you're overexposing. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. When you look at the histogram on your camera's display, you'll see that when you're overexposing, the whole histogram generally shifts to the right. And that's why it's called exposing to the right. And the reason that you want to do this is that when you overexpose, it brings out more details in the shadows. Now remember that with HDR, we have a whole lot of flexibility to edit and change and modify the exposure in post-production. So by having more details in the shadows, we're able to do a whole lot more with it later. So we overexpose a bit to get the details in the shadows, but we want to make sure that we don't blow anything out in the highlights, right? So what I do is I set my zebras on my camera to 95%. And once I see the zebras start to hit, I know that, okay, I'm about there. And if there's anything that's zebraing in my scene that I care about, then I know I need to maybe lower the exposure. Anyway, I tweak the exposure for the zebras, but try to expose as high up as you can. If you look on YouTube, you will find a ton of really good videos that go into crazy detail about Rec.709 color space versus Rec.2020, HDR, SDR, all the HDR formats and everything. They're great videos, but when I do a search for trying to find information about using HDR video in a Rec.709 SDR Final Cut Pro project, it ends up there's not a whole lot out there. There are a few tutorials, but as far as I can tell, every single one of them is going about it the hard way. Now, I'm not saying that they're doing it wrong. I'm just saying that they're doing it in a very convoluted, very complicated manner when it ends up that tone mapping HDR to SDR is actually really, really, really simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you my technique for doing the tone mapping, and then I'm going to show you the techniques that I've seen other people use. And you can be the judge. If you think the other way's better, that's great. But I personally think that my way is really the most efficient way to do it. All right, we are finally at the meat of this video. I'm sorry that the introduction took so long, but we're finally here. And the first thing that we need to do in Final Cut Pro is create a new library. So we'll go New Library, and we'll call this Test. Now you're going to notice in the upper right corner that by default, Test is a standard Rec.709 library. So the first thing that we have to do is go Modify, and we need to change this to a wide gamut HDR library. Now remember, we're not making an HDR movie. We're not making an HDR project, but we are using HDR media. So we have to set this to wide gamut HDR or it will not work. Now you can mix standard dynamic range and high dynamic range clips in a wide gamut HDR library. It's no big deal, but you do have to do this if you're using HDR media. All right, next step, let's go ahead and import some sample clips that I've got here. All right, now we need to create our project. We do New Project, and you'll notice right here that by default, Final Cut Pro wants to create a wide gamut HDR project. But we don't want to do that. We want to do a Rec.709 standard dynamic range project. Do that. We'll go ahead and drag our two sample clips over. Okay, Now, the first thing that you will notice here is that both of these clips look terrible. They are completely blown out. And the reason that they look blown out is because we shot these in HDR, but our Rec.709 standard dynamic range project and our display here are incapable of displaying this data. And you can see it in the waveform monitor here. Let me open this up a little for you. You can see that the brightness values go way beyond what Rec.709 standard dynamic range can do. So they're completely clipped. Now the data is still here. We shot it in HDR. We just can't see the data. So what do we need to do? Well, it's remarkably simple what we do. Let's go ahead, select this clip. We go over into the corrections, and we're going to do a color curves correction. All we do, drag the highlights down to 50%, and we make a little curve out of it. And we look at our waveform over there so that we get this where we want it to be. Something about in that range probably looks good. And there you go. Now it looks properly exposed. Nothing is blown out at all. The sky is here. The roof on the shed here is not blown out. You can still see the details. The only thing that looks a little bit off is perhaps the saturation. Now remember, when we shot this, I had the saturation on the camera set to -10, and that was intentional because we didn't want the colors to go crazy when we do this conversion. So what I'll do is I'll go to color wheels, and I'll just bump it back up a little bit, try to get that saturation back to where it needs to be. And the other thing that you can do here in the color wheels is you can do some further tweaking of the shadows and the midtones and the highlights, and here we go. So we'll get it about right there because it should be about right there, pretty bright. We want to try to hit 100 on the brightest parts of the scene here, the sky and the roof. Let's go over to the other clip, same exact thing right here. We'll go to color curves, bring it down to 50%, set our shadows and our midtones. And that looks about right. Oops, might be a little bit blown out there. And this one, the saturation actually looks pretty good. I don't think I really need to do anything to the saturation. I'll go to color wheels and let me just see here. Yeah, I don't think we need to mess with the saturation. It looks pretty good as is. So that's all there is to it. And what's great about this is that, like say for example, in this one here. Now if you saw my Aston Martin buyer's guide video, you'll know that there were a whole lot of different clips. This project consisted of probably 50 different clips of this. And all I have to do is I do this tone mapping on this one clip, and then I would go and I would just say edit, copy, and then if I had another clip, you know, let's just create a duplicate here. You know, if I had this and this was a different clip, let's just pretend, I would just say go ahead and paste effects, and it would copy everything over, and I could select a whole bunch of them. I could basically just modify all of my clips with a copy and paste. And so I don't have to do this on every single clip. It just do it once and there it is, and now everything's great. It's been tone mapped, and you can see that things in this scene that would have been blown out otherwise are perfect. There's nothing being blown out in the waveform monitor. If I had shot this in standard dynamic range, you can bet that the fender here, parts of the hood and back here, this quarter panel, would have totally blown out. Same with the sky. You can still see that the sky is blue here through the trees, but that would have blown out as well. But with high dynamic range, everything here is perfectly exposed, and we have a huge amount of flexibility to modify the exposure as we see fit. Okay. Let's go ahead and reset this. I'll go up here and I'm going to say remove effects. And now let's talk about the other methods that people use to do the exact same thing. One of the methods, the first one, is called color space override. I personally hate this method. But let me show you how it works. So the idea here is that let's select our clip, and instead of applying any sort of effect to it, we go to the clip inspector. And you're going to see over here, it says color space override, and it's off. Now, the color space of this clip is actually this one here, Rec.709 HLG. Remember, that's what we shot it on the Sony camera. We shot it as HLG. If I select this, nothing happens because that's what it was shot as. But if I go ahead and I change it to Rec.2020, boom, look at that. That basically converts it from a HDR down to SDR in one click. And you might think, well, wow, that's a whole lot easier than the whole curve thing. But if you look closer, it's not really done. It still needs work, right? The saturation is whacked now. So I still have to go in and I still have to now mess with the saturation. And even with the saturation kind of bumped up, it still doesn't look right. It looks kind of flat. And I could spend a fair amount of time maybe tweaking the shadows, trying to figure out how do I make it not look so flat. I know what's going on here, maybe the midtones. I could do a lot of this extra work, but did I really save any time by doing this? I don't think so, because I've got to go in and tweak it anyway. The other problem with this is, unlike the other method, the previous method I just showed you, you can't copy and paste this. So when I modify the clip properties here, this is modifying the actual original clip. So I cannot use this same clip anywhere else in a different way. Every copy I make of this clip in my project is going to have this color space override on it. And if I try to copy and paste the effects, it will have no effect. It will not copy and paste the color space override onto other clips. So I would have to either select all and do a color space override that way, and that will then do it, or I would have to go clip by clip and select which ones I wanted the color space override on. So there's no easy way to do this. I just don't like it. It doesn't save any steps. Initially, it looks like it's easier. You just do one click and boom, but the end results are just not acceptable. Even in this clip here, same problem. It's way undersaturated. And even if I go to the color wheel, I gotta select the right clip here. If I go in and I try to bump up the saturation, something just looks a little bit not as good as the other one. It's hard to explain. I think it's just because it still needs some tweaking with the highlights and the midtones and whatever. Anyway, that's the color space override method. So let me get rid of what I've just done. Let's reset it again. Turn that off. Make sure that we don't have any effects applied. Okay. Now, the next method that I've seen other people on YouTube use is the HDR tools method. HDR tools is a new feature, relatively new feature in Final Cut Pro. And let's go ahead and find it here. HDR tools, it's in your effects. Now, this one just doesn't work, but let me show you the idea here. We drag HDR tools into our clip. And then, when we look under our effects, we'll see HDR tools. And look at this. There's a pop-up menu for converting different clip formats to other formats. So this one says HDR to Rec.709. You might think, oh, well, wow, that's just going to convert it. Great. Well, look what we get. We get this still blown out and very washed out image. You might think, well, maybe it just needs the saturation fixed. Okay. Ugh, look at that. The colors are just really wrong and the saturation is not helping. The sky is mostly blown out, which is odd because if you look in the waveform monitor, you don't see anything blown out, but yet it is. Same with the roof. The roof is blown out at the top area here. So this does not work at all. Let's try it on this clip. HDR tools. All right, well, this one's not quite as offensive, but you can still see that it does not look right. It's super washed out. It needs some saturation. Let's bump up the saturation. Well, it's better, but it still looks unbelievably flat. And I don't think there's any way to fix this. I mean, maybe there is, but it would take an unbelievable amount of work to fix this. And I think the reason for this failure is that HDR Tools is really not meant to be used in this way. HDR Tools is meant as a conversion tool for actual HDR projects when you are outputting a final HDR video. I'm not going to go into the details about it. Most of the guts of it are here in the other conversion methods, but this mode does not work either. So let's go ahead and reset this one. Go ahead, edit, and remove effects. Okay. The third method that I've seen other people in other videos used is the LUT method, the lookup table, LUT method. This method does not work either, but let me show you how it works. Let's go ahead and apply a custom LUT to this clip. Whoops. Oh, my Final Cut Pro is thinking about it. There we go. Did it do it? It did. Okay. Final Cut Pro. LUT. Now, the way a LUT works is you can go online and you can buy or download pre-made LUTs that people have used that will supposedly convert from one color space to another, right? That's the whole idea. And there are some LUTs out there that supposedly convert from HLG3 to SDR. Well, let's try this one. Well, boom, look at that. It actually did something. It did get our luminosity more or less within the correct range, but the image looks terrible. The colors are, I don't know, a little bit gray and dark. And once again, I might be able to fix this, but it's going to require a huge amount of work. I don't even know if I can really fix this one. I mean, the shadows are really, whoops, not the saturation, but here it is, shadows, the shadow. Oh, no, that's not quite right. Midtones maybe? Yeah, I think it was the midtones. If I bring up the midtones and then the highlights, all right, we're getting closer. That's a little bit closer to where we're supposed to be. But once again, you know, it just took too much effort to get here. And the other problem with LUTs is that LUTs only work correctly when the source clip was shot with the correct settings that the LUT was built for. So if your white balance is off, or you know, it's just not the right kind of camera, it just has the sensor reads the colors a little bit differently, then the LUT may not translate correctly, and you'll get really weird exposures and you'll get really weird colors. Let me go back and remove the effects. And let's just take a quick look at this one more time. If I go in color curves, it's as simple as that. That's pretty much where I want it. Color wheels, saturation, boom. I mean, it really doesn't get any better than that. I mean, how long did that take to do? It took less than maybe 20 seconds to do it, and the results are what we want them to be. Personally, I like my method the most. I think a simple Luma curve is the best way to tone map HDR down to SDR, but if you like any of the other methods more, hey, feel free to use them. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that shooting in HDR is a huge improvement over shooting in SDR. It doesn't matter whether you're delivering final HDR content or whether you're just going to tone map it down to SDR. Either way, it's better than just good old-fashioned SDR. So, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And thanks for watching.